To the extreme, Fragile Narcissism and ADD/ADHD. Once upon a time, there was a young man named Mark who suffered from both attention deficit disorder, ADD, and fragile narcissism. From a young age, Mark struggled to pay attention in school, and his grades suffered as a result. He often found himself daydreaming or getting distracted by small things, which made it difficult for him to focus on his studies. As he grew older, Mark's lack of focus began to affect his relationships and career as well. He struggled to maintain friendships and often found himself feeling misunderstood or overlooked. At work, he had trouble staying organized and completing tasks on time, which led to several missed deadlines and lost opportunities. Despite these challenges, Mark also had an inflated sense of self-importance and craved attention and validation from others. He would often brag about his accomplishments to others and often become defensive or angry when others didn't give him the recognition he felt he deserved. It wasn't until Mark hit rock bottom, after losing his job and facing the prospect of losing his marriage, that he finally sought help. As he entered therapy to address his ADD and fragile narcissism, Mark began to realize how these two conditions were interrelated. His constant need for attention and validation was, in part, a way of compensating for his struggles with attention and focus. By seeking external validation, he hoped to prove to himself and others that he was capable and deserving of success. At first, Mark was in denial that he had a fragile narcissistic personality. He thought that his behavior was normal and that everyone else behaved in a similar way. But as Mark's therapy progressed, he began to realize how his ADD and fragile narcissism had affected his marriage long before he sought treatment. He had found it hard to accept that his behavior was causing harm to his relationship with Jane. His constant need for attention and validation had often left his wife feeling neglected and unappreciated. She would frequently express her frustration with Mark's lack of focus and inability to follow through on tasks or commitments, which he would often interpret as criticism and become defensive. Mark also struggled to empathize with his wife's needs and feelings, which had led to several arguments and misunderstandings over the years. His fragile narcissism had made it difficult for him to accept criticism or admit when he was wrong, which had created a pattern of defensiveness and avoidance in their communication. Over time, these issues had taken a toll on their relationship, and Mark's wife had begun to feel increasingly resentful and unsupported. She had tried to encourage him to seek help for his ADD and fragile narcissism, but he had been resistant and defensive, insisting that he didn't have a problem. However, as he continued his therapy sessions, he started to realize that his behavior was not normal, and that it was causing problems in his relationship. He learned that his outbursts of hysteria were a manifestation of his difficulty with emotional regulation. The realization that he had a fragile narcissistic personality was a hard pill for Mark to swallow. He had always prided himself on being confident and successful, and he did not want to admit that there was something wrong with his personality. As Mark continued his therapy, he began to learn about how his fragile narcissism had driven his need for attention and validation from others. He recognized that he had often used love bombing as a way of winning people over and getting them to like him, particularly in romantic relationships. Mark realized that he had used this tactic extensively with his wife Jane, particularly when he sensed that their relationship was in jeopardy. He would go overboard with gestures of affection, buying her expensive gifts and showering her with compliments, in an attempt to win back her love and attention. As Mark delved deeper into his therapy, he realized that his love-bombing behavior was rooted in a deep-seated fear of rejection and abandonment. He had always felt that he needed to be constantly on, always striving to prove his worth and value to others. When he sensed that he was losing Jane's love and attention, he would resort to love bombing as a way of reassuring himself that he was still desirable and lovable. Through therapy, Mark learned to recognize the harmful effects of his love-bombing behavior on his wife and their relationship. He began to understand that his actions were manipulative and self-serving, and that they were causing Jane to feel even more alienated and distant from him. As Mark continued his therapy, he began to realize how his lack of understanding and emotional regulation had caused many of the disturbances in his relationship with Jane. He had often blamed her for his own emotional outbursts and had failed to take responsibility for his own behavior. He would note the faults of her but not his own faults in the same situation, or that he was even the cause for the fault he found in her. Through therapy, Mark learned to recognize the ways in which his own patterns of behavior had contributed to the conflicts in his relationship. He began to take ownership of his actions and to work on developing healthier ways of coping with his emotions. One of the key strategies that Mark learned in therapy was to practice mindfulness and self-reflection. He started to become more aware of his own thoughts and emotions, and to notice the ways in which they influenced his behavior. He learned to identify the triggers that would often cause him to act out hysterically, and to develop strategies for managing those triggers in more constructive ways. With this new understanding, Mark was able to start taking the steps needed to manage his condition and to improve his relationship with Jane. He realized that he had often placed unrealistic expectations on her, and had failed to appreciate the challenges and struggles that she faced in her own life. Mark started to make a conscious effort to listen to Jane and to understand her perspective, rather than simply dismissing her feelings or blaming her for their problems. He worked on developing better communication skills, learning to express his own feelings and needs in a constructive way, while also acknowledging and validating Jane's perspective. Again, with the help of his therapist, Mark began to recognize that his behavior was causing harm to himself and to those around him. He learned that his need for attention and validation was not healthy, and that he needed to develop a more authentic sense of self-worth. Through his therapy, Mark was able to confront his denial and to accept that he had a fragile narcissistic personality. He learned that this was not a character flaw, but rather a mental health condition that could be treated. Through therapy, he was able to gain a deeper understanding of the impact his conditions had had on his marriage and his relationships in general. He learned to become more self-aware and to recognize the triggers that would cause him to behave in a narcissistic manner. He worked on developing healthier ways of coping with his emotions, and on building a more authentic sense of self-worth. Although Jane left their marriage, Mark was able to cope with the loss and eventually move on. It was a difficult and painful time for him, but he was determined to take what he had learned in therapy and apply it to his life moving forward. One of the most important things that Mark learned through therapy was the value of self-reflection and self-improvement. To do this, Mark continued his therapy even after Jane left. He also made an effort to stay connected with friends and family, and to build new relationships. Through this process, Mark was able to come to terms with the end of his marriage and to move forward with his life. He recognized that while the loss was painful, it was also an opportunity for growth and self-improvement. In time, Mark was able to find new love and build a happier, healthier relationship with someone who appreciated him for who he had become. He remained committed to his therapy and to continuing to work on himself, recognizing that the journey towards self-improvement is a lifelong one. It wasn't an easy journey for Mark, but with time and effort, he was able to find meaning in the experience and to use it as a catalyst for personal growth and transformation. In another scenario, Mark was able to rebuild his relationship with his wife. He worked hard to improve his focus and follow-through, taking steps to manage his ADD symptoms and be more present in their relationship. He also made a conscious effort to be more empathetic and supportive of his wife, recognizing her value and contribution to their partnership. While there were still challenges along the way, Mark's newfound self-awareness and commitment to growth allowed him to become a better partner and a happier, more fulfilled person. He knew that he still had work to do, but he was grateful for the opportunity to make things right with his wife and to build a better future together. Over time, Mark's relationship with Jane became more balanced and fulfilling. He no longer felt the need to constantly prove himself or seek external validation, and he was able to appreciate the value of their relationship on its own terms. While there were still challenges along the way, Mark was grateful for the opportunity to grow and evolve as a person and to build a stronger, healthier relationship with the woman he loved. Mark realized that without the help of therapy, it would have been much more difficult for him to become a better person and to improve his relationship with Jane. His ADD and fragile narcissism had been deeply ingrained in his personality and had been present for most of his life. Without professional help, he would have had a difficult time recognizing and addressing these issues on his own. Through therapy, Mark was able to gain a deeper understanding of his own behavior and to develop strategies for managing his emotions and improving his relationships. His therapist helped him to identify the patterns in his behavior that were causing problems, and to develop healthier ways of coping with his challenges. For example, Mark learned that his love-bombing behavior was a form of manipulation, and that it was harmful to his relationship with Jane. With the help of his therapist, he was able to recognize this behavior and to work on developing more authentic ways of expressing his love and affection. Similarly, Mark learned that his outbursts of hysteria were a manifestation of his difficulty with emotional regulation. His therapist helped him to develop techniques for managing his emotions and for expressing them in more constructive ways. Without the help of therapy, Mark would likely have continued to struggle with these issues, and his relationship with Jane would have suffered as a result. It would have been difficult for him to recognize the ways in which his behavior was harmful to himself and to those around him, and to develop the tools and strategies needed to improve his life. Through his experience, Mark came to appreciate the value of therapy in addressing mental health issues and improving one's overall well-being. He recognized that seeking help is not a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of strength and a commitment to self-improvement. In the end, Mark was grateful for the help he received through therapy, and for the ways in which it had transformed his life, and, in another scenario, his relationship with Jane. So in summary, Mark's journey towards acceptance was a difficult one, but it was a necessary step towards healing and self-improvement. He learned to focus on his own self-improvement rather than seeking constant validation from others, or pointing the finger at others for his own shortcomings. Mark had learned that the key to a healthy and fulfilling relationship was not in blaming others, but in taking responsibility for one's own actions. By learning to manage his own emotions and to cultivate a deeper sense of empathy and understanding, he had become a better partner, and a happier, more fulfilled person. That with the help of his therapist, he was able to work to develop healthier ways of managing his fragile narcissism and building stronger, more authentic relationships with those around him. By confronting his denial and accepting his fragile narcissistic personality, he learned to be more honest and vulnerable with his wife, in one scenario, and to show his love and appreciation for her in more meaningful and sustainable ways. That over time, with the help of therapy and medication, he was able to manage his ADD symptoms more effectively and develop healthier coping mechanisms for his fragile narcissism, and he found new ways to channel his energy and creativity. That, in one scenario, over time, Mark's efforts paid off. He began to develop a deeper sense of empathy and compassion towards Jane, and their relationship became more balanced and harmonious. They learned to work together as a team, supporting each other through the challenges of life, and celebrating each other's successes. While life still had its challenges, he was able to build stronger relationships and find greater success in his career. He was grateful for the support of those who had helped him along the way, and he knew that he still had work to do to manage his conditions. But he was proud of the progress he had made, and he felt hopeful for what the future might hold. If you or anyone you know is struggling with either of the symptoms mentioned here, it is only A+ to seek a professional to help from those who specialize in these areas. The benefits outweigh the idea of going it alone.